Our annual camping trip was always a perfect time to get away from the daily busyness of life, a way to reconnect with nature and each other. It's something we had been doing since we had gotten out of high school. Every summer, my friends and I would choose a different, often remote location to explore and go camping. And so this summer, the six of us, Sarah, Mike, Jennifer, Luke, Emily, and I decided to go further up north in Utah, into the Wasatch Cache National Forest. When the day finally arrived, we met at dawn. We had decided to take my beat-up old van that my father had given me as a graduation gift after high school, around 6 years or so. It was a family possession that was being passed down, so you can imagine what it looked like. I do gotta say, even though I was embarrassed about it at first, it is still running and getting me from point A to point B without any issues. It was spacious and had enough seats for all of us to ride together, even with all of our gear, which included all of our tents and camping stuff. The drive to the national forest was beautiful, and it also had amazing views. The road stretched before us as hours passed, and the landscape shifted from small roads to being surrounded by dense trees. We shared stories, and the occasional debate about the best path to take to reach our destination. Sarah, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, looked at the map that she had spread out, her finger tracing the various roads they could take. Alright folks, we got a couple of options here. The main road will take us through the heart of the forest, but this secondary road might offer a more scenic journey. Before venturing into the wooded pines of Utah, we stopped by one of the local forest offices to gather information. Google and iPhones couldn't always be relied upon in these remote areas, so Sarah had purchased a detailed local paper map. She was always the one planning every trip down in detail. I know we're used to having technology guide us, but out here, it's best to rely on good old-fashioned paper, she said, holding up the map with a grin. Mike, who was sitting behind me, leaned ahead, squinting at the map. Scenic is good, but how well maintained is that secondary road? The last thing we want is to get stuck out here in the middle of nowhere. Well, the map does say it's a bit longer, but it looks like it leads through some interesting landmarks. There's an old bridge marked here, and it seems like a more direct path to the campsite, Sarah said. Luke, who was sitting in the far back, raised an eyebrow with a grin. An old bridge, huh? Are we talking wooden planks, or Indiana Jones style adventure? Jennifer laughed. Let's hope it's somewhere in between. I'm all for adventure, but I'd rather not end up in a river. Leo, as the driver, what do you think? Sarah asked me. Well, seeing that we still have sunlight on our side, I say we take the scenic road. I mean, what's the rush, right? I vote for the old bridge. I'm gonna say the old bridge as well. Why don't we take a vote? Emily said. Everyone raised their hand except Mike. Sorry, Mike. Maybe next time you'll win, Sarah said. A decision had been reached. The secondary road, with its promise of scenic beauty. I veered onto the road, the wilderness and trees closing in. The path was narrow, flanked by dense woods that only gave way to small rays of the sunlight. After hours had passed and the sun began to set, we found ourselves coming across the bridge that spanned the river, the water reflecting the fading light, a contrast to the woods that lay ahead. It looks like this is the old bridge Sarah mentioned, Mike remarked, as I slowed down the van. Sarah peered out of the window, her eyes scanning the bridge. It definitely has that rustic charm, but I hope it's sturdy enough to support the van. Luke's grin returned as he leaned, his excitement evident. Well, there's only one way to find out. Jennifer laughed. Alright, but if we end up in the river, Luke, you're swimming back to the campsite. I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous. The bridge looked like it was a mixture of concrete and wood. What if we didn't make it? When was the last time this bridge was used? I eased the van slowly onto the creaky bridge, not even knowing what the point of driving slowly was, because if it was to break, it was gonna break. The worn planks made noises beneath the weight of the van as the river flowed gently below. I looked in the rearview mirror to see everyone's scared faces as we crossed, still maintaining my eyes on the road back and forth. I saw Emily's eyes as she gazed out the water below. This is something like an adventure out of a movie, isn't it? I'm expecting to see hidden treasure on the banks, she said. Mike chuckled, his grip steady on one of the handlebars. Yeah, you're right. We're gonna find out what adventure this is if we end up falling, because you all decided to come through this raggedy bridge. Mike was always the more serious one, but courageous in the group. He always took challenges head on, and nothing ever seemed to scare him. Luke was the joker of the group. His sense of humor was always there, even in the most serious moments. Sarah, on the other hand, was our friend who was the most caring of the group. As I said, she always assumed the role of our mom, always making sure everything is planned to the detail. Emily was just silly all around. She was a close friend of all of us, that we simply enjoyed her company. She was the most serious female of the group, but didn't have the seriousness of Mike. Well, if that even makes sense. We ended up making it across the bridge, which I do want to point out, it's not even a long bridge. It simply looked like a small construction bridge that someone built to be able to get across. As the sun started going down, we continued driving with the trees closing in around us even more, almost creating what looked like a tunnel, with the headlights of the van being the only source now piercing the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached our destination, a dirt open field that looked like where vehicles had parked in the past. Tall pine trees stood around the field, forming a natural dome that seemed to welcome us from the outside world. Alright everyone, this is it, I said as I parked the van and stepped out, the air carrying a smell that hinted at the adventures that awaited us. There was a small stream nearby, its gentle flowing of water adding to the nature that surrounded us. We unloaded everything and we walked a little bit deeper into the woods until we stumbled upon a clearing not too far from where we had parked. We began the process of setting up camp, pitching tents, arranging firewood, and establishing a central gathering point where the campfire would soon be set ablaze. As the sun finished dipping below the horizon, casting the area in complete darkness, the tent stood up and the campfire pit awaited. We were all fascinated by the beauty of this place, away from the busyness and the stresses of every day in our life. So the first night there started fine, but as the campfire flames flicker in the breeze, we huddle around the fire, sharing stories and laughing, with a sense of security over us, just because of the presence of each other. With the trees casting long shadows over our campsite, and the branches creaking softly in the night wind, our voices would rise and fall as we took turns recounting past stories and adventures. We talked the normal things when you hang out with friends and family, the same old stories from the past. Hey, remember that time Luke tripped over his own shoelaces and didn't have anything else to wear? Emily giggled, making fun of Luke. He chuckled and rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, I remember. And I'm still gonna say that the tree root came out of nowhere. Jennifer leaned in. Or what about that haunted house we dared each other to explore? I'm pretty sure we all had nightmares for weeks after that. Sarah with a smirk. Alright, but what about this, y'all? The time we heard those strange noises outside our tents during that camping trip in the mountains. Mike's face turned serious and said, Man, I thought we were being surrounded by wild animals or something. That's right, and then we found out it was just a bunch of raccoons having a party in the woods, I said. Of course, throughout this whole time, Emily couldn't say anything but laugh. The night continued on, and it was always a great time to gather with my friends, especially after not seeing them for so long. As we were telling and recounting past adventures, something caught my attention. I was looking over to Mike as he was talking, and for a quick glimpse, at the edge of the woods, where the firelight struggled to penetrate the darkness, there was movement, a flicker of shadow that seemed to move between the trees. I quickly stood up and focused with my head to look over towards the tree line, as I exchanged glances with the others. Did any of you see that? I whispered. Luke turned to look where I was looking and squinted into the darkness. What did you see? Maybe a deer or something? It moved kind of strange for a deer, I said. Jennifer leaned closer to the fire. I hope you're not trying to pull a prank, Leo. As I looked deeper into the tree line, still trying to get my eyes adjusted from staring at the fire for too long, I saw that the movement in the trees and branches was getting closer. It was something, or someone. I kept staring out into the tree line. This movement was drawing closer, slowly becoming visible by the light the fire was giving out. And that's when I noticed a silhouette of a hunched figure. And I guess that's when Luke finally saw it, because he said, "It looks like a person." "Do you think it's someone lost in the woods?" Emily whispered. "I hope it's not someone who's hurt," Sarah said, with concern in her voice. Luke chuckled. "Well, if this person is hurt, they're sure moving better than I would be. Who even goes wandering around the woods at this hour?" Emily said. At this point, all of us were standing, and that's when I decided to say, "Who's out there?" I yelled. Then, just as the silhouette became clear in the tree line, that's when a voice broke the silence.
"Greetings, young ones,"
this person said in a voice that held both wisdom and innocence. Emerging from the trees, I saw it was an older man.
"Forgive my intrusion. I spied the glow of your campfire from afar, and was drawn hoping it wasn't a wildfire that I would have to put out. This land, you see, holds a history long forgotten by many."
His steps and his form, revealing his age not only in his slightly stooped posture, but also in the deep lines engraved on his face. It was as though he was an extension of the trees surrounding us. As he drew closer, the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest underscored the quiet intensity of the moment. Finally, he approached the campfire, revealing his full features as he introduced himself.
"Pardon me, my name is Tog."
His voice, very old and raspy, with one of his eyes semi-shut, scars and years of life showing on his face. I offer a friendly smile. "Hey, I'm Leo, and this is Luke, Sarah, Emily, Jennifer, and Mike. We didn't expect to have company out here. What brings you to these woods at this hour?" He stared at us with his one eye.
"The woods have always been my refuge, my sanctuary, my safe place. I come here to remember the old ways, to honor the native land that sustained my ancestors."
"Native land?" Jennifer questioned, her voice in a serious manner. The old man nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Staring at them, he said,
"Yes, this land was once home to my ancestors, and I have wandered these woods to honor their memory. But in all my years, it's very rare when I encounter fellow souls under these stars."
Mike leaned in, with curiosity but in a serious tone. "So, what brought you here tonight?" With a faint smile, Tog said,
"Your fire, as I said before. But then I heard the laughing that echoed through the trees. It reminded me of times in the past where I shared, and bonds were forged around similar fires."
"Are you telling us that you're camping out here too?" Emily asked. Tog's chuckle was like the rustling leaves themselves.
"Well, not quite. My old bones prefer the comforts of a proper bed, but I do find peace in these woods, even under the cover of night."
As the conversation flowed, Tog's words painted a picture of his relationship with the woods. The way he spoke, the stuff he was saying, seemed like he was one with the forest.
There is nothing like finding peace and comfort within your own self, in the beauty of nature. There are hidden trails that go through the forest, roads known only to those who have taken the time to listen to the whispers of the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every flowing stream, and every whisper of the wind carries echoes of the past.
His voice full of reverence of the woods.
Listen, The ancient wisdom of this land has much to teach if one is willing to listen.
I'm not sure what it was, but the way he spoke and the way he looked seemed like he was just a hippie who loved the outdoors. Pretty harmless in my opinion. I took a step towards him and put my hand on his shoulder. Toad? Well, how do you spell your name? I asked. My name?
Well, that's the first time that somebody has ever asked me how to spell it. As I mentioned, I have a native background, so it's spelled Taog.
I figured that's how you spell it. Just wanted to make sure. Well, Toad, we're sharing stories ourselves, and it seems you have quite a few to tell. Would you care to join our campfire? His eye glinted with appreciation.
I would be honored to, young man.
As he settled into a log near the fire, and we all sat down, his presence seemed to infuse the night with a deeper sense of connection. He started telling stories of the hidden trails, the forgotten stories, and the ancient wisdom that whispered through the leaves, blending with the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the trees. He spoke not just of the past, but of the living spirit of the woods, a spirit that resonated with each of us as we gathered around the fire. As he delved into his stories and what seemed to be a TED talk on how we need to respect the woods and nature, he told us how he comes into the forest to spend seasons, to honor his spiritual ancestors, how he owns a few remote cabins, and has learned to be self-sufficient just like his ancestors. However, one specific story caught the attention of all of us. He told the story of a supposed creature that haunted these very woods for generations. Then, his voice took on a somber tone, and even the crackling fire seemed to be quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to listen.
The whispering goat,
he began, his words dripping with a mixture of reverence and dread,
is a creature of darkness, a shapeshifter that walks a fine line between man and beast. It has a twisted power, the ability to mimic the voices of those it encounters, drawing them into its trap.
As he detailed this supposed creature, our circle grew tense. I could see the eyes of everyone else that they were paying attention to this specific story. He then lowered his gaze, and his voice, almost a whisper, he said,
"A few decades ago, my brother ventured into these woods, drawn by the whispers of familiar voices. As I was searching for him, I heard my own voice calling out to him, but it wasn't me. It was someone else calling out to him. That's when I think my brother believed he was responding to my call, but it was the whispering goat's deceit, and so he never returned, and I never found him. His fate, shrouded in mystery. I have carried the weight of that loss ever since, haunted by the knowledge that he may have fallen prey to the whispering goat."
A shiver crept down my spine as we all listened. When he concluded his tale, there was silence. Even the fire seemed to have absorbed the weight of his story as it started to go down. With a slow and crippled movement, struggling to get up, he rose from his seat, his eye meeting each of ours in turn.
"I thank you all for allowing an old man to share his stories with you. But the night grows old, and it's time for me to return to the embrace of these ancient trees,"
he said in a voice that contained gratitude and sorrow. As he stepped away from the fire, he turned around and said,
"I almost forgot. Stay close,"
he said in a warning voice,
"and do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know."
The darkness seemed to cover him as he walked away, making him one with the shadows of the woods. It's almost like he was part of this landscape. We watched in silence as he receded into the darkness, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even the noises of the forest seemed to hold its breath. a quiet reverence for the figure that had imparted both wisdom and a warning. And as the echoes of his footsteps crunching the leaves faded, the woods returned to their symphony of rustling leaves and distant whispers. A heavy silence fell within our group. Well, what the fuck was all that about? This hippie love-making tree hugger most likely has his tent somewhere out there and lives out here in the woods, Luke said. We tried shaking off the feeling, but I could tell that anxiety had filled everyone, thanks to the power of a supposed well-told ghost story. But as the night deepened, the campfire had dwindled to embers, and a thick blanket of darkness fell over the campsite. I do want to point out that whenever we went camping, we always either slept inside a tent or outside altogether by the campfire. I guess nothing like actually experiencing the beauty of nature. Tonight, we decided to all sleep in our sleeping bags around the dying campfire, as the events of the evening and the stories still linger in our heads. We all decided to go to sleep, and as I was falling asleep, in the dead of the night, that's when I heard it, a whisper that seemed to move through the air. It was a voice, soft and insistent, calling my name, Leo. I fully woke up. I sat up in my sleeping bag, with my senses on high alert, my eyes widened, scanning the darkness and everyone else laying down, the faint glimmer of dying embers offering little comfort. Did anybody hear that? I whispered, hoping to see if anyone around me was awake and heard. Mike, who was sleeping next to me, sat up and said in a groggy voice, hear what? Someone whispered my name. It sounded like you, Mike. Mike's expression shifted from grogginess to a growing sense of unease. That's not possible, Mike said, his eyes flickering to the dark woods that surrounded them. I was asleep? Jennifer then arose with a voice of mixture. Are you sure you didn't dream it, Leo? I know that we're all on edge after the story told by Toad. I haven't even gone to sleep. Every noise out here is making me stay awake. I know what I heard. It was right here in the camp, I said. Man, go to sleep, bro. You're hearing things now. Stop being such a wuss. There's nothing out here, Mike said. But then, just on the edge after Mike's last word, the faintest whisper, Leo. Everyone fell silent. The voice was real, undeniable, and it sounded like it was next to our campfire. We all looked to Mike. What? I didn't say anything, Mike said. Of course, it was complete darkness, so we couldn't even really see each other out there. So we all just huddled even closer with everyone else waking up groggy as well, and getting closer together too, seeking refuge in our shared presence. Okay, what's going on, y'all? I said. It's most likely that old Pawpaw trying to prank us. He's most likely out there with more people scaring campers, Mike said. Well, one of us should stand watch and just be on the lookout. It's already 4 a.m. and the sun will begin to rise in a few hours, I said. Of course, none of us ended up going back to sleep, and we all just stood awake with eyes wide open. The morning couldn't come soon enough. Seeing the daylight brought relief, but as we remember the night, others, including Luke, Sarah, and Emily, admitted hearing whispers as well, each in the voice of a different member of our group. We tried brushing it off as imagination, simply fueled by the stories that Toad was telling us last night. We got ready for the day, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shadows on the forest floor. Emily suggested that we take a hike along one of the nearby trails that's on the map. Maybe some fresh air and a change of scenery will help us relax, she said, her voice trying to sound hopeful. Mike and Luke exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity. I guess it wouldn't hurt to explore a bit. I'm sure it was that old man whispering our names out from the trees last night. If I find him, Once we go out there, he's really gonna be looking like an old dead beat up tree. Thanks to stupid Leo for telling him our names, Mike said. Sorry guys, I seriously thought he was just an old hermit walking through, I chuckled. There have been times in the past when we became friends with other campers in our annual trips, and we all shared names, even phone numbers, to communicate in the future, so I actually didn't think too much of it. We set off on the trail, our footsteps breaking the silence of the woods, the sunlight filtering through the leaves and patches of gold. As we walked, our conversation gradually shifted from the events of the previous night to lighter topics, remembering old camping trips, sharing funny stories, and debating the best way to make s'mores. It was almost like the woods were allowing us a moment of peace, a chance to reconnect and find comfort in each other's company. Hours passed, and we eventually found ourselves in a small clearing by a small stream. The sun was beginning its descent. We took a break, sitting by the water's edge, dipping our fingers in the cool stream. Check this out, y'all, Luke said, his voice with a mixture of excitement. He pointed to a tree where patterns had been carved into the bark. Sarah stepped closer, her fingers tracing the carvings with a sense of wonder. It's like a message left behind, she said as her eyes traced the lines. As we looked around more, we discovered other things. Small artifacts hanging from branches, crafted from natural materials, by sticks and stones, and even with symbols painted onto the stones. Hey, it's like the woods are trying to tell us something similar to what Togue said. Emily slightly giggled. Mike raised an eyebrow. Or maybe it's just people messing around in the woods, you know, leaving their mark. Luke nodded in agreement. And branches crafted into what looks like symbols. They could be signs that they communicated like this back in the day. I guess the stories that Togue was sharing with us last night really did prove that we were in the midst of Native American land, and all these symbols and sticks and stones we found only reinforced that belief. Who knows? We might be standing on ground that's witnessed generations. Maybe these woods have secrets that date back centuries, Jennifer said. Look guys, I get that this all seems interesting and everything, but let's not forget that we've been on these trips every year, and every time there's some sort of spooky tale or mysterious superstition that pops up. Remember the haunted lake we stumbled upon 2 years ago? Mike said. Emily chuckled, her eyes with amusement. The one with the vengeful water spirit that would drag people under if they swam too far out? Mike with a grin. Exactly. And what did we find? A perfectly serene lake where we spent a whole day swimming and goofing off. Luke chimed in. And don't forget the enchanted forest last year, where we were told that we would get lost if we ventured too far into the deep woods. Jennifer, with a laughing tone, said, Right, we found a trail with signs pointing us to various landmarks. Sarah joined in, and let's not even talk about the cursed campground, where they said that we would have to ward off evil spirits to make it through the night. As everybody was laughing, Mike nodded, his point emphasized. See y'all, it's always been a bit of fun and games, fueled by local legends. I'm not saying I don't appreciate the spooky environments, especially by the campfire, but come on y'all, this is just the same old stuff we have encountered before. Emily grinned in a sarcastic and playful tone. So you're telling us you don't believe in any of this? Not even a tiny bit? Mike shrugged. I'm not saying I'm a complete non-believer, but I do think a lot of people exaggerate. Like, what are the odds that we stumble upon some mystical artifacts on this trip, right? Or a whispering goat? Luke raised his eyebrows and said, Maybe the woods are trying to prove you wrong, Mike. The back and forth continued with everybody as Mike reminded us that we were all friends who had been through it all before. As the day transitioned into evening, we made our way back to the campsite. The sinking sun painted the sky orange and pink. We couldn't ignore the fact that another night was approaching. A night that, given recent events, filled us with a mix of anticipation and dread. Back at the campsite, we set up and got dinner ready. The campfire crackled to life, with its flames dancing, and the forest too seemed to come alive with the chorus of all the critters starting to make noises. As darkness settled over the campsite, we gathered around the campfire once again. The events of the previous nights were still fresh in our minds. As the evening went on, a thick fog started to surround the entire campsite, and as our campfire struggled, its light barely puncturing the fog, Mike, always the brave one, volunteered to gather more firewood. He ventured out into the mist, his flashlight beam gradually merging with the surroundings. This is when everything went to hell. As the fog started getting more thick, and it was getting even more darker, we realized that Mike had been gone for a while. The minutes felt like hours. We exchanged glances. He's been gone for quite a while, y'all. Shouldn't he have been back by now? Emily said with a concerned voice. Maybe he got lost in the fog. One of us should have gone with him, Luke said. Jennifer's eyes were wide. What if he's hurt? What if he encounters something out there? After about 30 minutes, the environment grew heavy. The campfire's embers started to sputter. The fog had taken on an almost suffocating presence. Maybe we should go find him. We can't just wait here in the dark, Sarah said. And that's when I decided to get up. And I said, I'll go look for him. I mean, how far can he be, right? I took about 2 steps the way Mike had left. And that's when I saw a figure emerging through the fog. It was Mike, and he was coming back with firewood, except the way he was walking was very dull. As he approached the campfire, his movements were mechanical, almost as if he was in a trance. Sarah, always the one to confront difficult situations, broke the silence. Did you get lost or something? He turned to look at her. I'm fine. I found firewood. The unease in the air deepened, each of us sensing that something was wrong. Mike's presence felt off. It was as if a shadow had draped itself over his being, distorting his familiar features. His whole demeanor was replaced by an emotionless state. I couldn't help but notice something strange about Mike. He was sitting slightly apart from the group, staring directly at the flames, not even saying anything. I was thinking he was just tired or scared, so I tried to engage him in conversation. Hey Mike, remember that one time we got lost and had to spend an extra night out? But he didn't respond. Well, he did, but his response was delayed. And when he did answer, his tone was off. It lacked the seriousness I was used to. It was almost like he was hearing us talk, but responding to questions a moment too late. You mean when we thought the squirrels were plotting against us? Luke chimed in, trying to break the growing tension. Yeah, that's right, and you were convinced that the woods had eyes and ears. Mike's laugh, if you could even call it that, sounded forced. A hollow echo, you can say. Yeah, good times, he replied, his gaze distant. Emily leaned ahead with a concerned voice. Hey, Mike, are you okay? You're acting different. Mike then looked at her. I'm not sure. Something about this place. It's like it's under my skin. Jennifer's voice held a note of unease. Weird things have been happening tonight. The voices, the fog. I think we should consider leaving. Mike's gaze remained fixed on the flames. His voice almost lowered to a whisper. Maybe that's not a bad idea. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. We exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the strange things happening, now impossible to ignore. I looked around at my friends, each face reflecting a mix of fear. It was a painful realization that the place that had once been our escape was now a source of unease. Well, we should leave. Something isn't right here, I said. Nods of agreement followed, the decision being unanimous this time. The prospect of abandoning our camping trip was sad, but the safety of our group came first, and so we started packing everything. It took about 30 minutes to break everything down, and by then, it was now completely dark. However, as we finished packing our gear and glanced around to make sure everything was ready, a sinking feeling settled in our stomachs. Mike, who had been acting distant and detached, was just standing by the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the woods. Unlike the rest of us, he hadn't lifted a finger to help with the packing, and his usual seriousness and energetic self replaced by an almost trance-like state. "Hey Mike, are you alright, man?" I said with a concerned tone. Mike's response was slow and distant, as though his mind was somewhere far away. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking." Jennifer, exchanging a worried look with all of us. It was clear that something had changed in Mike. As we started getting ready to walk from the campfire back to the van, that's when we heard it. Somewhere in the distance, we heard another voice. It sounded like Mike's voice, and it was calling out, sounding confused and pleading for help. And that's when Emily said, "So if that's Mike calling out to us, then who is?" As we turned around, Mike was still staring into the woods, but that's when his body started contorting, almost glitching like. Chaos erupted. Jennifer, always quick thinking, threw a log towards this Mike that was standing on the edge of the campsite and yelled everyone to run back to the van. Guided by adrenaline and our flashlights, we dashed through the woods. As we all ran with our belongings, I dared to not look back. But still, a horrible screech drew my attention back to see what had caused this. And that's when I stopped in my tracks to see that whatever this thing was now had its limbs stretched and twisted, reshaping into something that defied the laws of nature. But it was the face that sent a shockwave of terror through me. The human features contorted and elongated, the skin stretching and warping as if it was struggling to contain the monstrosity beneath. The eyes, once familiar and warm, became stretched out and unnaturally slanted, their color shifting to an abyss-like blackness that seemed to absorb all light. The nose receded and resembled the snout of a goat. The mouth was a grotesque smile, its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged, pointed teeth. Every detail was a horrifying mixture of human and animal. That's when I felt my body come back to life, and I yelled to keep running and to not look back, not knowing that even if they got to the van, how would they even get inside because I had the key? I kept running and running, thinking what would happen if this thing caught up to us. And then, there, in the distance, I saw the clearing of the trees and familiar sight of the van, and heard my friends screaming to hurry up. As I neared the van, I saw that the real Mike, with his clothes torn, was there with the rest of the group. With no time to lose, we crammed into the van and sped off. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw this creature standing where we had parked at. After about 5 minutes of driving, Luke finally spoke and said, "What the fuck was that?" That's when Mike finally spoke and said, "When I ventured into the woods, the fog seemed to grow denser with each step I was taking. Soon, my flashlight was the only thing piercing the gloom. I had collected some firewood when I heard whispers. I heard y'all's voices calling out to me. I tried tracing them but got lost. Then, I saw me, or a copy of me. It looked like my reflection in a murky pond." Mike then stopped talking, struggling to find the words. This other me was trying to draw me closer, with words and voices that belonged to you all. That's when I decided to hide behind a tree, using the shadows as cover, and every time I tried to make a move towards the camp, it seemed to sense me, always blocking my path. I thought I was done for, but then I remember a stream we crossed earlier. That's when I made a dash for it and jumped in. The flow carried me downstream, away from that thing. I crawled out, exhausted, and walked towards the van. That's when I started yelling for you all, and that's when you all came running from the forest. As we were speeding away, all the trees were whipping past us, their branches scratching the sides of my van, almost like desperate fingers trying to pull us back. Over the noise of the engine and the pounding of my heart, that's when we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere, all at once. As I kept my eyes on the road, the headlights briefly illuminated a monstrous form darting between the trees. The creature was a horrible version of a goat, but massive in scale, murky gray, almost appearing slick in the dim light, with ragged scars and patches of bare skin. Its eyes, though, were the most terrifying. Deep, soulless pits of black. "What the hell is that?" screamed Emily, clutching her seat. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, with the van's engine roaring. The creature, with an incredible speed, moved through the dense forest, its every leap and bound bringing it closer to us. As we went through a sharp bend, this thing lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from the rear window. Luke, who was in the back seat, rummaged through our camping supplies and hurled a flare out the window. It lit up the surrounding area in a bright crimson glow, distracting the creature for a few seconds. I continued speeding, tires screeching, and for a moment, it seemed we had lost it. But then, a screeching noise that echoed through the woods. The creature resumed its relentless pursuit, its form now even more twisted and grotesque under the flickering light of the flare. The road ahead clear, revealing the bridge we had crossed earlier. Realizing this might be our only chance, Sarah shouted, "Get across the bridge, now!" We barreled into the bridge, the van shaking under the strained boards. As we reached the halfway point, a deafening roar filled the air. Looking back, we saw the creature stop at the bridge's edge, with what looked to be an evil smirk, an image that still haunts me to this day. I'll even provide a drawing at the end if anybody wants to see it. After a few hours of driving, we finally left the woods and found the safety of the dim-lit streets of a nearby town. We pulled into a Waffle House, and we sat in a corner booth as we recounted the evening's events, trying to make sense of it all. Jennifer, her hands wrapped around her mug. "That old man, Togue," she began. "He knew too much about the whispering goat. Don't you think? There was agreement between us." I started rubbing my head and responded, "It's not just that he knew about it. Remember how he just appeared out of nowhere, and how, after he left, things immediately took a turn for the worse." The eyes of Sarah widened, and the way he emphasized not to trust familiar voices, almost like he was setting us up, giving us a clue about the thing we were about to face. Mike, looking more pale than usual, added, "When I was in the woods, trying to escape that thing, I heard more than our voices. I swear, I heard the voice of that old man calling me, trying to draw me in. I think he might have been the whispering goat himself." We all exchanged glances. The thought was too horrific to fully grasp. Had this creature taken on the look of an old man to toy with us, to get close, to study us? But why would he warn us about himself? It doesn't make sense, I said. Unless he enjoys the chase, the fear. Maybe for an old creature, the hunting is more thrilling, Luke said. We all sat in heavy silence, pondering the possibility as we pieced it all together. The sudden appearance of Togue, his detailed stories, and the hunting events. The conclusion became clear. The old man, with deep-set wrinkles and tales of old, had likely been the whispering goat himself. That happened a few months ago, and the trauma still lingers. First up was when we lost touch with Mike, who moved to another state, I guess to escape the memories. From that moment on, everything else changed. The once tight bonds between us frayed. Our group chats grew quiet, and any future gathering ceased. And the annual camping trip became nothing more than a distant memory. The haunting echoes of that night lingered, and every rustling of leaves, every faint whisper, served as a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the woods. The memory of the whispering goat and twisted grin haunted my dreams. A constant replay of the terror that unfolded before us. The mere thought of venturing into the wilderness sent shivers down my spine, a sensation of impending doom that I couldn't shake. As time passed, the memory of that horrifying encounter began to fade. We did all end up going separate ways, and I found methods to cope with the nightmares I experienced afterwards. I even went and talked with a counselor, because every corner that I looked, every voice I heard, at night when I was falling asleep, I swear, I would sometimes hear those faint whispers. Last night, I was walking alone in a park near my apartment. The sun had set, and the moon was shining bright. I quickened my pace as the nighttime brought back episodes and bad memories of the night in the forest. With my heart racing as the memories of that night flooded back, that's when I heard it. A faint distant sound that sent shivers down my spine. Whispers, soft, as if carried by the wind itself. I stopped in my tracks, straining to make out the words, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I heard my name, Leo. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, and the whispering seemed to grow near. And then, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, much like the one we had heard that night in the woods. Fear flooded my veins, and I finally tore my gaze away from the darkness, fleeing from the park as if my life depended on it, which at this point it most likely did. The whispers and the noises seemed to chase me, echoing in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I locked every door and window, heart pounding like a drum. I tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was all in my head, anxiety, and a product of what happened in the past in the woods. But deep down, I knew it was the whispering goat. As the night continued, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something evil lurked just beyond my vision. And just as I was about to close my eyes that night to try to sleep, I heard it again, the whispers, closer now, almost like a soft breath against my ear. Leo, Leo. My blood turned to ice, and I clutched my cover. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure, its eyes reflecting the dim light like deep, soulless pits. The figure's mouth opened, and it spoke, its voice using all of my friends' voices, distorted and nightmarish.
We missed you, Leo.
With my eyes never leaving the figure, with trembling hands, I rushed to the front door, my heart pounding so loud that I couldn't even hear anything else. And then, just as I reached past the door, I heard one last whisper, faint but unmistakable. Run. I bursted out the house, leaving everything behind. I got inside my old trusted van and sped away to my parents' house, who lived about 2 hours away. And I never went back again. It's almost midnight. I'm at my parents' house, and here I am, sharing and writing this to you all. in the hopes to warn you. Everything is real. It's not in my head, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows, whispering its haunting lullaby. Those moments when you second guess a distant call of your name, when you are alone at home tonight, in bed, falling asleep. Do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know. I never told this story to anyone, and I don't really intend to tell it again. I have a pounding migraine today, and this thread has kept me good company as I drifted in and out. I actually don't like talking about this time in my life. When I was around 12, I lived with my mom. We were below the poor level. We lived up in the mountains around Santa Cruz, California. My mom had a friend that owned a large bit of property up there, and he let us stay in a trailer up there. Our trailer was very small and was right beside a garden. A chain link fence ran around the garden to keep the dog the owner had out, along with other animals. All kinds of deer and things are very common in the area. Also, along the fence area was a single room. It was like a tiny house, but it was only a single room on the inside. This room had light, and since our actual trailer didn't, I spent a lot of my time in there. By the way, sorry that the story will be fairly long. I'm actually pretty bad at writing. I just want to say that first, as this will be the only time. So there's this one thing you should know right now. This small fenced-in area was only a small part of the property, but most of it was just a bunch of woods. Also, I refused to leave the fence area because the owner's dog had been mistreated by children in the past and was very sketchy towards me all the time. If I was alone, it would try to bite at me, even through the fence. The fence was tall, at least 7 feet high, and wasn't even movable. So as long as the gate was closed, I was safe. With that being said, there is no one else around us for miles and miles. Now I'm telling you all this because I think it's important that you understand what kind of scene this was before I really get into the story. So we have a fenced-in location that seems fairly safe. It contains a trailer and a single room with power that is not connected to the trailer. Nothing else around for miles. My mom's van is parked out in front of the gate to the fenced-in area, and a single unpaved road runs from this garden for about a mile to the main house. Now then, I would bring friends up there to sleep over here and there. We all thought it was pretty cool, you know. Besides, we would get our own room to stay in, to play video games all night long. It was like a dream come true. The only downside was simple. When it would get dark outside, it would get really dark. No city around, and the trailer would not be lit up. There was no bathroom to use in the room, and you would have to walk through the dark garden in order to get to the trailer to use it. Strange things would happen out here from time to time. It was always something that could be somewhat easily explained away though. Noises like people working at night, or once me and a friend were sitting out in the garden and we saw a shadow as big as a small bear bound up a tree, but the tree didn't shake like there was weight on it. The dog also creeped me out, but you know, angry dog, and I was a kid. It happens. Now, I do get scared pretty fast. I always been that way. For example, I have trouble walking through a lit house if I'm alone. My friends, however, tend to be more outgoing, just the kinds of people I get along with. This time, I had a friend over. His name was Jacob. We were staying up all night and playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on my Sega Genesis. We started playing as the sun went down, and by the time we were finishing up the game, it was around 2 a.m. That's when we heard it. We turned off the game, getting ready to find something else to play. There was a rumbling in the woods behind the room we were in, like somebody was rolling something really heavy around. We hadn't heard it before because the noise from what we were playing was loud. I immediately got goosebumps. Jacob was not really worried about it, but it's not like there was someone else's house a yard right over there. It was just a forest for miles, and it sounded like someone was constructing something or some shit, dragging and rolling something really heavy. Eventually, Jacob convinced me to just play some more games. I agreed on the condition that we turn the volume down so we could hear if something happened. We started playing, and I didn't even notice that the noise had stopped because I was into the game. A couple hours later, Jacob said he had to use the bathroom. I was feeling fine by then, so I was fine when he left to the trailer to relieve himself. He was taking a while, so eventually, I decided I was going to go check on him. Besides, I could use the bathroom and grab a snack while I was at it. I got up and opened the door to leave, and when I opened it, he was just standing at the doorway, right outside the door, facing it. It scared the shit out of me. That's when I asked what he was doing, and he just stood there, blocking the exit. I realized he must have sneaked up to the door because I could hear him walk away from the room, but I hadn't heard him walk back up to it. It was super quiet out there, without the noises of the city. I should have been able to hear, but he refused to say anything or respond. He just stood there. I told him he was really creeping me out, but it wasn't like him to try to scare me like this. Finally, I decided to just go to the trailer and use the bathroom myself. I told him what I was gonna do. Then I moved past him, but when I pushed him out of my way a little, his skin felt freezing to the touch. I jumped a little, but it was a cold night, and he had been standing out there for like 30 minutes, so I figured that was to be expected. I walked as quickly as I could over to the trailer, and that's when he followed me, like, right on my tail. It was unnerving. I joked a little, saying that he already surprised me by scaring me at the door. The joke is over already. Finally, I got to the trailer and walked in. He didn't follow. He just stayed at the doorway. Now, I want you to picture this. Imagine inside a trailer with the door open in the middle of the night, and your friend is just standing outside a trailer looking in. I checked on my mom, who was fast asleep. Then, I turned to go into the bathroom. It was a porta potty, and we keep the bathroom door shut because it smells bad. When I reached for the door and tried to open it though, it was locked. That's when I heard a nervous voice come from behind the door. In here. I quickly turned to look at Jacob, but the door was still open and there was nothing there but pitch black night. I froze. I would have heard the bathroom door open if he had come in behind me and gone that way. There is no way to do it quietly. That's when I just yelled out so loud that my mom woke up. I stared at the doorway, unable to bring myself to move a muscle. She got up, walked over there, and looked out. Not seeing anything, she closed the door and asked me what was wrong. By now, Jacob was coming out of the bathroom and acting perfectly normal, but just a little bit confused. I explained what happened, and Jacob said he was just taking a long time in the bathroom, basically. None of them believed me at all, no matter how much I insist. My mom is sure that I just got sleepy and imagined it, and Jacob thought I was trying to prank him. So my mom gets out a big flashlight and walks us back to the room. She tells us to go to sleep, then she leaves and goes back to the bed herself. Now, this room doesn't have any windows or anything, so after a while, I calm back down a little bit. I'm telling myself that my mom was right. It must have been like a waking dream or something. Meanwhile, Jacob insists that he was in the bathroom the whole time, and I'm inclined to believe him, because there is just no way to really get around without being heard. So I settled down, but I'm a little rattled, but I'm thinking that I can just sleep it off throughout the night. Suddenly, the dog starts going nuts, right behind us. The room is up against the fence, so the dog must have been like right behind the room on the other side. I guess when the dog started going nuts, I got scared, because Jacob started laughing at me and said, "The dog barking at a squirrel or some shit, and you're over here shitting yourself." It keeps going like that for a long time though. Suddenly, the barking stops and gets replaced by whimpering. We hear the dog run away. There's about 45 seconds of silence before we hear something new. A small stretching sound on the back wall of the room. We both try to be silent as we can. Eventually, it stops. After 5 or so minutes of silence, Jacob decides to be brave. He decides that he's gonna wake up my mom to tell her something crazy is going on. I wish he wouldn't leave me alone, but there's absolutely no way I'm gonna go out there. He arms himself as best as he can with a tennis racket we had in the room with us. Then he takes a couple small steps and opens the door and dashes out. I close it as quick as I can behind him. In less than 30 seconds, I hear a scream. Not long after, the door flies open, and he comes back in looking pale as a ghost. He looks tired and his breathing is like he just ran a marathon. His eyes look as big as dinner plates. I then ask what is going on like 4 times before he finally starts getting words out. He tells me he walked out there and he was walking through the garden as quick as he could, and then he saw my mom, just standing there. He tried to talk to her, but she stared at him with a blank expression. Getting super creeped out because of what happened to me earlier, he took a couple more steps towards her, telling her that he thought something was in the woods. Suddenly, her face turned to an awkward smile. Then he realized something terrible. He hadn't noticed sooner because of the darkness. She was on the other side of the fence. Now, the door to this room does not lock, and as I explained earlier, this room had no windows. As he is telling me what happened, he is also at the same time putting stuff in front of the door, and by the end, I was helping him. In retrospect, whatever was harassing us seemed to not want to actually enter the room or the trailer, because the Jacob one didn't come into the room or to the trailer itself. Either way, we stacked everything we could against the door, thinking somehow, like in cartoons, this would actually definitely keep the creature out. So for the rest of the night, we heard scratches coming from all around the room. I, of course, ended up crying. Jacob looked like his mind had left his body with fear. At one point, whatever was out there was speaking as well. I heard it from right next to me where I was resting against the wall, in my mother's low voice, the same exact phrasing she had used earlier in the night. "What's wrong?" Followed by, "Go to sleep." The sun must have come up eventually. The scratching as well stopped. We heard my mom come to get us. This time, we actually heard footsteps. We of course refused to leave the room. My mom had to go get the property owner and have him take the door off. When we saw that it was actually her, I burst into tears again. We never had any experiences like these again, and we eventually moved away. But that one night still haunts me. I still refuse to go out at night unless I'm with a bunch of people, and I will never, ever live in the woods again. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed hearing about this, as I probably won't tell the story again. Thanks for listening. When I was 23, I had a security gig at a dairy farm in Ohio. It was a modest place, only holding a few dozen cows at any given time. My then co-worker, a 34-year-old recovering meth addict named Corey, had just been fired for letting a cow go missing on his watch. An offense that would get you fired in every sense of the word. For starters, Corey was insane. By the time we met, he was seriously addicted to all kinds of drugs, and it rendered him virtually schizophrenic. Long nights were spent with him during my training period. He would tell me about the CIA and how they were out to get him. He was convinced that they were broadcasting thoughts into his head, and that they would stop at nothing to ruin his life. More than once, I would catch him glancing over his shoulder or peeking out of windows with a dumb look on his face, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was following him. That's the type of person that Corey was. Each of our cows had an ear tag labeled with a number. At 8 p.m., they were each to be guided into their own respective stalls and locked in for the night. Padlocks became the norm after an incident with local kids a few years earlier. In the mornings, we would have to carry around a clipboard containing each lock combination and individually release each one. It was the most annoying way to start the day, but the cows were more secure that way. That's what made Corey's story so unbelievable. He had claimed that the previous night, cow number 29 had been locked away in her stall along with the others. He told us that the only thing out of the ordinary that night was a bat stuck in the rafters that he planned to deal with in the morning. In order for his claim to be true, an intruder would have unlocked the barn with a set of keys, unlocked 29's stall with the correct combination, then reset the locks and leave undetected. Either that, or they picked up a 1,600-pound animal and leaped through a window. Considering Corey's nasty habit of abandoning his duties in order to twitch and hallucinate in the corner, a small part of me believed that some two-bit thief might have been able to get one over him. My boss, however, a 50-year-old hothead, concluded that Corey must have been involved with the cow's disappearance and kicked them to the curb. With nobody else to fill his position, my boss had offered to pay me extra for each of his duties that I could complete until we received a new hire. Naturally, I agreed. I would be heading back to school in a few weeks and needed all the money I could get. My first night back at work began normally. Since I would now be doing the work of 2 security guards, I would arrive early to get a head start on Corey's checklist. I started out by sweeping out the barn. Farmhands try to keep the TMR in a long pile just in front of the stall door so the cows could eat throughout the night, but that shit practically painted the floor by the time I got there. Midway through, I noticed something reflective in the corner of the barn. I swept a loose bit of corn and hay over it to investigate. On the floor before me was a neon yellow ear tag, and I picked it up to examine it. 29. Next to 29's ear tag were the skeletal remains of a bat. I guess that was just another thing that Corey never got around to dealing with. I swept up the bones along with the rest of the barn. By the time I finished, it was already 8 p.m. I made my way out to the fields, and one at a time, I guided each cow to its assigned stall. I got through about 10 or so before I noticed something strange. Across the field, about 50 meters away from everything else and all the others, was a cow, alone. It faced away from me, seemingly transfixed on a nearby cornfield. Seeing a cow on its own is nothing strange, as they sometimes need personal space the same way as people do. What was strange, though, was the way that her tail stuck straight out from behind her, unwavering. She stood as if she were afraid to slip, with her feet planted far apart. Perhaps the strangest of all, her head appeared to be tilted at a 90-degree angle. I wasn't eager to tell my boss. They had already put down so many sick cows before, but losing 2 in the matter of a week might have been enough to send them over the edge. That's when I decided to save that cow for last, as I continued to guide the rest of them inside for the night. Being in charge of twice the amount of cows I was used to was time-consuming. It took me nearly an hour to round them up. By the time I locked number 36 for the night, it was 9 o'clock. I should have been making my rounds by then, especially given the circumstances. I just had that last cow to deal with. When contemplating how long it was going to take me to unlock each cow in the morning, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The only stall left empty was number 29. I shuffled to the field, and surely enough, she was there. She hadn't moved an inch since I started the process of moving them. I approached her slowly. It was surreal seeing a creature frozen in such an odd position. As I came up on her, I could hear a definite, but muffled, chittering. It was unlike any noise I had ever heard from a cow. What the fuck did you eat? I thought to myself. I whistled to the cow before approaching her to avoid scaring her. On a dime, the chittering ceased. The cow's left ear rose to face the sky and began to oscillate like the periscope of a submarine. I could tell that moving this one would be a challenge. I rubbed her back, attempting to calm her down. Bonding is key when establishing any sort of relationship with an animal. I had never interacted with 29 before, so we were unfamiliar with each other. Her skin felt bizarre, like clay with hide draped over it. I walked around to see her face. Her eyes were peeled open, darting around. Her mouth hung open and drooped to the side. I examined her left ear, searching for a place to reinsert her tag, but there was no piercing. I strapped the halter to 29's mouth and began to lead her. It was like trying to uproot a tree with a bike chain. Each tug that I gave was useless. I began to put my weight into it, but still, no luck. When I say no luck, I don't mean that 29 wouldn't follow me. I mean that her body showed zero sign of being affected by my body weight whatsoever. Cows are strong creatures, but they're not made of stone. I was perplexed. After 15 minutes of this, I decided that it was useless to continue on, with the clock ever ticking. I could no longer afford to neglect my rounds. I began to walk to the security post to collect my flashlight and get on with the night. I heard a slow trotting. I looked behind me to see that the cow had in fact moved. 29 was now facing me, not so shy now, I wondered. I turned around and continued walking towards the gate. When I made it halfway through the field, I began to hear the trotting again, but this time it was louder and much quicker. I smiled to myself. Wish I would have known to walk away sooner. Without turning to face the cow, I walked into the barn and began fumbling with 29's padlock. 3 left, 32 right, 23 left. As the lock clicked open, I heard the floorboards behind me creak. A slow, vocal noise turned to a sickly gurgle. I hope to God whatever you got isn't contagious, I said before spinning around. All color drained from my face as I was greeted with the sight of the 8-foot-tall beast standing before me. On its hind legs, its ears were flapping like a hummingbird's wings. Its head was cocked sideways with one eye focused on me. Its pupils seemed to grow and shrink as it scanned over my entire body. Its lower jaw slowly moved up and down as it began to vocalize again. It began to creep towards me. Its front legs were kicking as it attempted to keep balance, all the while making that same noise. I began to feel lightheaded. I grabbed 29's padlock and made a break for the door. That's when the cow began to stomp behind me. I began to hyperventilate as I sprinted. The rest of the cows were spooked, shaking and jumping around as well. I slammed the door shut and clasped the padlock. A sickening boom shook the entire wall of the barn as 29 began to claw at the door. Oh, 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 the beast croaked before chittering once more. I backed away from the door slowly, its wooden frame bending and contorting at the sheer force behind it. Without another warning, I turned my back to the barn and ran to my car as 29 began wailing and pounding. I never ended up making any rounds that night. Instead, I started my car and left that fucking place in the rear view mirror. I didn't even tell my boss. In fact, I avoided several of his phone calls because I had nothing to say. I figured it would be best if I just quit the easy way. There are certain things in life that back you into corners. Silence forces your hand, you know. That's why I'm writing this now. I still wanted my money. A few weeks later, just before making my 2-hour drive back to college, I stopped by the farm to pick up my final check. My boss wasn't in his office on Tuesdays, so I took advantage of the situation and granted myself access with the key that I had seen him kick under the rug once or twice. After snagging my check and a few Jolly Ranchers, I got in my car and slowly began to drive away. Out of the corner of my eye, a young farmhand standing in the grazing field caught my attention. I lowered my window and said, "Hey kid, stay away from the night shift," but he didn't answer me, nor even look at me. He just continued to stare at the pile of bones before him. As I kept driving, I kept staring at him, and he wouldn't even move an inch. That's when something struck me as odd. His head was tilted sideways, similar to 29's head. I swear, I'm never going back to that farm again. It was late June of 1968. My dad was 12. My grandparents had moved a few months earlier from Tucson, Arizona to Concho, Arizona. Concho was very different, both in landscape and temperature. Sitting at 5,000 feet above sea level, the summer temperatures were around 70 degrees versus the hundreds in summertime Tucson. Resting at the edge of the White Mountains, the land is red, yellow, and brown sandstone cliffs and buttes against a larger ancient basalt flow ridge that lines the north from the Springville volcanic range. Well, Old Concho, as it's referred to now, sits among the high desert, with large basalt ridge bordering the east and north. In the valley, a dry riverbed was dotted by large cottonwood trees. The buttes and ridges boasted large twisted cedar trees. Only about 200 people lived in Concho at the time. It's in pretty close proximity to the petrified forest. Therefore, petrified wood was found on the valley floor. There were also numerous ancient Anasazi ruins scattered along the valley. My great-uncle had moved his family to Concho as well. My grandpa had recently finished his engineering degree, and he and my great-uncle were doing highway construction all around the White Mountains. They had both purchased land in the Concho area for pretty cheap. My great-uncle had 2 sons who were a year older and a year younger than my dad, Tony and Zach. Tony was 13 and Zach was 11. They would spend their days exploring the surrounding landscapes, joined by my dad's American bulldog, Sarge. They had found quite a few ruins, numerous pictographs, and some old abandoned homesteads, most likely from the 19th century. Every morning, they would load up their bags with canteens, bologna sandwiches, and head out into the wilderness to play and explore. My grandparents and great aunt and uncles had only one rule that was for the children, and that was to return by sunset. As my dad recalls, on one summer morning, they ended up hiking towards the edge of the giant basalt ridge to explore. After going for about a mile or so, they came upon an arroyo running adjacent to the ridge. Large black boulders and giant slabs of sandstone peppered the wash. The banks were pretty steep, but they would have to cross it if they want to explore the ridge on the other side. They made their way down slowly. Once in the arroyo, they realized that the opposite bank was too steep to climb, so they started following it west to find a better place to climb up. My dad said as soon as they got into the riverbed, he started getting an unnerving feeling, like they were being watched. He said it was extremely quiet, no birds or cicadas chirping. It was hot as well, no breeze stirred the air. The further they walked down the wash, the more a sense of urgency began to build in his gut. He didn't say anything though, for fear that his cousins would laugh at him. About a half mile or so down the wash, it made a bend around a large volcanic boulder. Suddenly, Sarge began a low growl, hair standing up on his back. This actually startled all three of the kids. Looking around, they didn't see anything, so encouraging the dog, they moved closer to the bend. Sarge stayed rooted to the spot, growling and barking. All three of the boys began to get scared. They agreed that maybe they should just turn around. They noticed that there was a spot where they could climb out of the wash. They hadn't noticed it at first, but it looked almost like a game trail. With adrenaline fueling them, they hauled ass up the side of the embankment towards the ridge, the dog darting after them. The whole time the bad feeling was growing stronger with my dad. They stopped at the top to catch their breath. Sitting against a large boulder, they took some drinks from the canteen and assured each other that Sarge probably smelled a coyote or spotted a rabbit. Here, the game trail was more apparent. It had even worn into some of the volcanic and sandstone that protruded from the ground. They noticed that there were a lot of petroglyphs dotting the black rocks, geometric shapes, animal, human figures. There were so many. Finally, they found a large juniper with a trunk and ate their lunch and shaved. Bellies full and excitement replacing fear. They hurried along the trail as it slowly zigged and sagged the side of the basalt ridge, avoiding large areas of rock falls. The pictographs began to change as well along the trails. Lots of spirals and horn-looking men. My dad even said there was one that looked like a UFO. Turning around a bend, the trail disappeared. Only open space of the edge of a cliff. There was nowhere else to go. The cliff dropped off to one side, and a sheer cliff going up about 50 feet on the other side. My dad, he was disappointed, but also a little relieved, as the sun was getting further west, and they were pretty far from Concho now. They could see the town in the distance, as well as the holy mountain and mesas that dotted the distant Navajo res. Even though they were disappointed, they decided that it was worth looking at the view. They started making their way down the trail when they spotted an opening in the cliffside, a side canyon. They hadn't noticed it on the way up. It was behind a large twisted cedar. The tree's shadow had hidden it. It looked almost like there was another trail going into the divide. The opening was about 4 feet wide. Looking at it, that unnerving feeling returned to my dad. His stomach dropped and he felt like it was twisting in knots. The hair on the back neck stood up. Tony suggested that they should detour and check it out. My dad protested, saying that they needed to get back. Zach stayed silent. He looked as scared as my dad felt. Tony laughed when looking at them and called them both sissies. He said if they didn't want to go, it was fine, that they could wait there for him and be babies if they wanted. That's when Sarge ran down the trail and was out of sight. My dad whistled for him, but he didn't return. Zach decided he would follow Tony, so my dad stayed behind while they entered the narrow black walled canyon. When they moved out of my dad's field of vision, the wind picked up, blowing through the canyon and trees, making a creepy sound. It was quiet except the wind, and my dad thought he heard faint voices on the air. He shivered, the ominous feeling growing stronger. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and still, Tony and Zach had not returned. A large cloud had covered the sun, and drops of rain began to fall. My dad moved under the cedar to get out of the light rain that began to fall. He sat on a rock and began to shiver. Suddenly, something grabbed his shoulder. He jumped about 3 feet and screamed. Then he heard laughing. It was Tony and Zach. They looked extremely excited. "Luke, you'll never believe what we found," they said. "We found some Indian steps and they lead to a cave." They begged my dad to come see. It wasn't far, only about 10 minutes into the canyon. My dad ended up following them, knowing they weren't going to agree to go home until they showed them. Plus, he felt a little braver and more intrigued now. Sure enough, around a bend and about 20 yards into the canyon was more wide, about 20 to 30 feet across, and there were indeed foot and handholds carved into the rock wall. My dad had seen steps like them before, when his parents had taken him to Chaco Canyon National Park. They were smaller than the ones in Chaco and only went up about 20 feet to the darkened mouth of a small cave. He shivered from excitement or fear, he wasn't sure. From the bottom of the canyon, there was no way of telling how large the cave was. They dropped their packs and decided to use the foot and handholds to climb up to the cave against my dad's better judgment. The rain had stopped, but they slowly and carefully made their way because the rock had become slick. It took about 10 minutes to ascend. My dad called for Sarge from the top again, and the dog still hadn't returned. The cave was much larger and deeper than they expected, and the entrance was decorated with hundreds of petroglyphs. The light didn't penetrate very far in, but they could see light in the distance from an opening in the roof. So they entered. Light adjusting to the dark, they started to notice that the ground was covered with objects. What looked like rocks and debris now revealed itself to be pots, beautiful, painted pots of all shapes and sizes, black on white, painted with geometric patterns, and animals, red pots and even some yellow ones, large pots holding dry corn and crusty squash and beans. There were also pots filled with arrowheads and beads. They even found some instruments like drums and flutes. They didn't touch anything and kept walking deeper into the cave. They looked around in shock and in awe. They had just discovered something big, something very big. They moved now towards the second bit of light streaming in from a crack in the roof. The cave was littered with all sorts of artifacts, stone axes, pots of all shapes, colors, and sizes. As they passed under the crack, they noticed now that there were objects in alcoves in the wall. My dad moved closer to one, and his blood froze. He was looking at a human body. It was decayed skin and hair clinging to patches and its mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. He took a leap back. Tony and Zach also froze. The walls were lined with alcoves filled with dressed bodies, lining the walls as far as they could see into the darkness. Suddenly, an ominous and horrendous screech broke the silence of the cave. All three boys jumped, and my dad, looking in the direction from where the sound came, saw two red and glowing eyes. He froze, locked in place by those glowing red eyes. Suddenly, the cave was washed over with the stench of decay and death. The eyes began to move towards the boys. Slowly, another hideous growl, screech, jolted them from being petrified in place. The eyes were moving fast now, right towards them, and they heard what sounded like running footsteps. They turned and tore out of the cave as fast as they could. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them in a blind panic. The entrance to the cave was maybe 30 yards away. My dad looked back against his better judgment and saw a man on all fours, or a giant coyote. He can't be sure. He pushed himself faster, screaming for the others to also run faster. They reached the edge of the cave, having to turn around to scrabble back down the foot and handholds. Zach got there first and began descending as fast as he could. Tony was next. His face turned into a wash of horror as he went down. My dad's heart was hammering into his brain by now. He turned and saw the eyes only about 20 feet from him. The stench of decay was overpowering. It made his stomach turn. As fast as he could, he placed his feet in the first set of footholds and started clambering down the rock face. He could hear the creature's breath now, and even feel it. He refused to look up as he was going down, trying to concentrate on the hand and footholds. He heard Tony scream from below him and looked to see Tony lose his hold and slip about 5 feet from the bottom. He landed on his side and began to scream with pain. My dad slowed himself a bit, still not daring to look back up. After what seemed like an eternity, he leaped from the cliffside down the last 2 feet. Zach was helping Tony to his feet, and Tony was frozen looking at the cave and ancient staircase. All the color gone from his face. My dad was in full panic, and not looking, grabbed Tony and helped Zach drag him away. They flew down the little canyon. Finally, before they passed the turn, my dad looked back to see the red eyes watching them from the darkness. Another screech rang from the cave, and at that moment, Sarge in a full run came from around the bend, growling and barking. He ran to the foot and handhold staircase and bellowed up that cave, the hair on his back standing straight up, snarling and growling. The sounds of the dog filled the canyon. As my dad turned the corner, he saw those red eyes retreat back into the cave. They emerged from the small canyon and stopped briefly to catch their breath. The sounds of Sarge barking and growling echoing down the canyon. Tony at this point was now crying, his face washed with pain. His arm, he said. He thinks he broke it. Zach was silent. My dad was then asking Tony if he could make it home. Tony responded he sure the hell wasn't staying anywhere near whatever that was. Suddenly, a shrill cry came from the canyon. It was a dog, in pain. "Sarge," my dad cried, but Tony and Zach had started running down the trail. My dad screamed again, tears coming from his eyes. There was no response. It was quiet. My dad thinks he hears something. He looks up to the canyon entrance. It sounds like drums. My dad sits there confused. Drums? What the hell? Is he losing his mind? The drums are getting loud. Is this in his mind? Where is Sarge? He can't leave him. My dad sees Zach tearing back up the trail. "Luke, we have to go." The drums are louder now, and he can hear faint chanting. Zach grabs my dad and jerks him to his feet. "Don't you hear that?" He screams and shakes my dad. "We have to run, now." My dad is woken from his grief as fear washes over him again. He runs down the trail with Zach. Tony is waiting at the edge of the arroyo, waiting for them. The wash is now running, about 6 inches deep. They notice for the first time that a large thunderhead has developed to the south. A huge, large black storm dominating the southern horizon, lightning flashing in the distance. A new source of danger crosses my dad's mind. He tells Tony and Zach they need to cross the arroyo as fast as possible. If it floods, they will be stuck on the side with the basalt ridge, with whatever that thing was. They make their way down carefully and slowly. Tony is having a hard time because of his injured arm. They now start hearing thunder rolling across the air, and the wind has increased. My dad is keeping a close eye on the creek, which has only risen a couple of more inches. They make all the way down and across the creek. The place where they crossed is only 30 yards or so ahead, so they scrabble their way towards it. The water starts rising now at an alarming rate. They start going as fast as their legs will carry them. They're exhausted, but keep pushing on. Suddenly, my dad, who is in the rear, starts to hear loud splashing coming from behind him. His heart drops. It followed them. It's getting closer. He closes his eyes, bracing for impact. That's when he feels something lick the back of his swinging hand. He turns, bracing for impact, and sees Sarge. Joy fills my dad. He bends down and gives Sarge a quick hug as the dog runs past, and the dog bounds after Tony and Zach as they climb out of the arroyo. My dad runs and begins to climb. When he's almost to the top, he hears crashing and loud snapping coming from the arroyo. Making it to the top, he sees a wave of brown debris filled water crash through the wash. He falls to his butt and watches as the flash flood fills the little canyon. Tony and Zach are lying on the ground, gasping for air. My dad tries to catch his breath. He feels dizzy. He feels tears welling up, and Sarge comes and licks his face. My dad sees that Sarge is covered with blood. He looks over the dog and finds several slash wounds on his back. His ear is also torn. They don't look too deep, but he can't be sure. Zach is the first to speak. He is asking what it was, but no one responds. Tony's arm is beginning to swell pretty badly, and it's only a few hours till dusk. They're all thirsty and realize in their panic they left their packs in the small canyon, along with their canteens. They are no longer in a hurry. They are exhausted. They drink some rainwater that has pooled in one of the large sandstone boulders. They figure whatever that thing was, it's not going to be getting across the arroyo for a few hours. So they slowly make their way back to Concho as the thunderhead to the south continues to fill the landscape. The three boys and Sarge make it home around 8. The sun has set, and my grandparents and great uncle and aunt are worry sick. They are relieved and angry until they see the condition of the trio and the dog. The boys tell them about their horrendous tale, and Tony's parents rush Tony to the nearest doctor. That night, my dad sleeps with Sarge at the end of his bed. Despite him being extremely exhausted, he is plagued with nightmares. One that he speaks about all the time is especially terrifying, where he sees the red eyes looking in through his window. When he wakes up though, in the morning, his curtains are closed. The rain continued for 2 or 3 days. The boys don't leave their homes, still terrified of what happened. My grandpa and great uncle are convinced what the boys encountered was a mountain lion, but they are intrigued by the story of the cave they found. A few days later, when the weather is clear, they tell the boys they want to see the cave. They make the journey faster this time, using my great uncle's Jeep. My grandpa and great uncle also bring along a couple of shotguns and rifles in case this lion is still in the cave. The boys show them the arroyo, which has been filled with new boulders and broken trees from the flooding. They find the trail and start making their way up. My grandpa on the front and great uncle taking the rear. They find the boys' packs caught in a cedar bush. They have been shredded. My grandpa figures they must have been caught by another flood, and they ended up in the trees. They finally make it to the little hidden canyon, which has been blocked by a juniper that washed down during the rain. My grandpa and great uncle get the log out of the way, and they go to the canyon to the Indian staircase. When they look up though, they can make out the darkness of the cave. The water washed away all signs of the boys' previous passage. My grandpa figures maybe at this time of day, the cave is more illuminated. So he and my great uncle climb up the foot and handholds to the top. The boys wait at the bottom, having no desire to go back up there again. It's only my dad and Zach. Tony with his broken arm stayed home. My grandpa calls down for them to climb up. They do as they are told and climb up. When my dad reaches the top, he is stunned. The cave is gone. It's only a 20-foot rock alcove next to a black basalt cliff covered with petroglyphs. He's confused, looks around. He goes over to the wall looking for cracks and sees nothing. My grandpa and great uncle end up questioning the boys. Were they making up stories? No, they weren't. Something attacked Sarge, and the boys hadn't made up being that scared. The dads aren't mad. It's a neat area. Maybe some other weekend they will look for the cave again. My dad and Zach know that this is where the cave was. There's no doubt in their minds. They found their packs and even passed by the UFO petroglyph, but they can't convince the adults, so they make their way to the Jeep that is parked on the far bank of the arroyo. As they load up, sun sinking low in the western sky, my dad looks back at the black basalt ridge, wondering if maybe it was all just a dream, but something in the shadow of a cliff catches his eye. He squints against the sun and sees two red shining eyes looking back at him. His blood goes cold. He turns around as the Jeep pulls away. My grandparents only stayed in Concho for another few months. As soon as my grandpa finished the highway project, he got a job offer in the U.S. Virgin Islands. My dad said after that encounter, he had nightmares every night and would swear that at night he would see the red eyes outside of the house until they finally moved from Concho. After he moved, he never had a nightmare about the eyes again. But it wasn't his last encounter with the red-eyed creature. He would see it again when he became an adult. But that is a story for another time. There are things out there in the woods at night that we, as humans, should not disturb. This is my first time publicly telling this story. It almost sounds like the generic monster in the woods story, but I've been holding on to it for a few years now, and I'm finally ready to tell it. I live in the hill country of Texas, and this event happened back in August of 2018. I promise you, it's true. As anyone in Texas can tell you, August is very hot. The summer is what I like to call Diet August. And for good reason. I worked as a maintenance tech for a school district, so the heat and manual labor were my best friends. One of my buddies called me one day around lunchtime, and he told me there was a problem at his family's ranch. Apparently, one of the horses had gotten loose and ran off the evening before and hadn't returned. So he asked me if I could help look for it. It was Friday, and I didn't have any plans, so a trip to the ranch sounded like a great way to spend the weekend. A few hours later, I got another call. This time, I was told they found the horse, but it was dead, and that now we would go hunting for whatever killed this horse. For those that don't know, there aren't that many apex around here. Plenty of coyotes and wild pigs, and very rare, a mountain lion. But that's about it, unless someone has some exotic stuff on their land. One time, I saw a zebra chilling under a tree while driving down some back road. When I got off work, I went home and got changed into some hunting clothes and prepped my gear. At the time, I had an SKS, which actually worked fine. Ammo was very cheap. I assumed that we would need some quick follow-up shots, so I know it would do the job. With a big sharp knife to hang on my belt, I felt ready for whatever would happen. My friend picked me up, and we drove for about 2 hours before we finally arrived at his family's ranch. The ranch was beautiful, thick forest, rolling hills, and a lot of wildlife. The basic layout was the main house situated down a dirt road that took several minutes to navigate, so it was set pretty far from any roads. About 100 yards from the house was the barn where most of the equipment was kept, a couple of ATVs, and a cool little side-by-side that was always a blast to drive. There was a field where the horses were kept, but aside from that, the area was just wild land. Trails had been cut so many times that they formed very reliable means of exploring. When we got out of the car and got my stuff unloaded, I was told we were waiting on a couple more people to show up. Fine by me, the more the merrier. In the meantime, I was told to go to the barn and see what was left of the horse that had been retrieved from the forest. The scene that I saw was not something I expected, even though I really didn't know what I was expecting to see. It was torn to ribbons. Deep slash marks covered the body. The stomach was torn open, and I could see tooth marks where something had taken bites, but it didn't seem like it had been fed on, more like demolished than a fit of rage. That ruled out coyotes instantly. If a pack was strong enough to take this horse down, they would have done their best to pick it clean. It also couldn't have been pigs. There were no signs of injury on the lower legs. That left us with some maniac roaming the woods, or a mountain lion. The lion, rare as they might be, looked like the culprit. It actually broke my heart, thinking that we would have to kill it. To be honest, I would rather find a way to remove it and take it somewhere safe. But if it's taking down horses, it would have no problem taking down a human. The sun was slowly getting lower in the sky when the other guys showed up. I won't use their names, of course, but there were 4 of us. We discussed options for something and decided that a grid search using maps of the ranch would be our best bet. However, with so much land to cover, we would each take an area to sweep. Every 10 minutes, we would have a radio check to make sure we were safe. One of my favorite things about coming here was that there was some pretty awesome stuff we could use for our shenanigans. Tonight, we would have sets of night vision goggles. I chose the one with the head mount, so I could have one eye available to see normal. One thing about using night vision is the lack of depth perception, and I'm not keen on tripping over every bump on the ground. We chose our grid to search, checked our gear, tested the radios, and off we went. By our 3rd radio check, I was finally in place to start looking. I took out the map, used my compass to situate myself, and picked the direction to walk. The sun was real low by now, and was already near pitch black under the canopy of oak and cedar trees. With the night vision over my eye, I was creeping through the brush, trying my best to make as little noise as possible. From the sound of it, I was the only creature being quiet. The forest was teeming with all the critters beginning their nightly activities. Raccoons, possums, cottontails, and jackrabbits. Of course, you can't forget about the bugs. The constant chattering of cicadas, mixed with crickets and whatever else is out there, made noise that gave the area an almost deafening feeling. Slowly I scanned the area with the night vision, rifle in the low ready position. 2 radio checks went by, when I suddenly realized that the woods had gone quiet. Standing alone at night in a forest that no longer has any noise is a scary thing. Generally, animals will go quiet when danger is nearby. The problem was, nothing seemed to care about my presence, and now there was dead silence. I made my way to a clearing and found a tall hill. It looked like a good point to get my bearings. so I climbed a fairly steep slope. At the top, I had as close to a commanding view as one could hope when surrounded by tall trees. In any way, I was about maybe 20 to 25 yards from the tree line. The sun was down, with the last glimmer of purple and red sinking below the horizon. Navigating was about to get a bit more difficult. Using the night vision, I tried to pick out any landmark I could see to figure out where I was on the map. Swinging my head around, I caught a reflection of eyes in the trees. They were big and bright and unblinking. I stared for a moment, deciding what I should do. I could see pretty well in the clearing, thanks to the moonlight, but in the tree line was pitch blackness. I called out to the eyes, trying to get whatever it was to move so I could see it better. I could tell it was taller than a deer, or basically anything else that lived there. So I thought it was a person. Suddenly, I was really wishing it was a mountain lion. A horse mutilating cycle was not what I wanted on my hunting bingo card. I called out and said, "Hey, this is private land. You need to leave right now." Nothing happened for maybe 30 seconds. When I heard the eye speak, it said, "Leave right now," in a perfect impression of my voice, as though it was recording. Safe to say, that was extremely unsettling. I raised my rifle and said, "If you don't leave right now, you're gonna die." As soon as I said that, the eyes lifted as though they had stood up. The height from my best guess was maybe 7 to 8 feet, depending on how tall the tree next to it was. Then it moved, stepping out of the darkness and into view of my night vision. It repeated my words again, saying, "If you don't leave right now, you're gonna die." For a moment, I was in shock. This thing looked sickly white, maybe gray. It had a long and slender frame. Without a second thought, I pulled the trigger and fired. How I ended up missing at this distance was a mystery to me. But I fired again, and this time the bullet struck home. The creature let out this monstrous, unnatural wail like a mountain lion's scream, mixed with what sounded like an air horn. I was stunned, nearly paralyzed with the most primal sense of fear I have ever experienced. Then it took a step towards me. I fired again, and again, and again, emptying my entire magazine of 20 rounds, but it still kept walking. If I hit it, I didn't know because it hadn't screamed again. Without taking my eye off of it with the night vision, I fumbled to eject the magazine and was reaching for another when it stopped walking maybe a yard from me. The creature stood there, staring at me. It didn't have any hair, and its skin looked as though it was merely wrapped tightly around bone with no muscle or definition. The eyes were small. Despite having a massive reflection in the IR, there was a line that I guess was most likely the mouth. I stood there, not knowing what to do. It raised its hand towards me, and then I saw the fingers. There were 4 fingers, long and black, tapering down to something like an ice pick. That's when the smell hit me. It was like hot vomit, with the odor of decay and feces. In my brain, I knew I had to get away from it, but I physically couldn't move. Just before the fingers made contact with my shoulder, there was this moment of clarity and I was able to move. With a fluid motion, I dropped my rifle from my hands, falling across my chest and being caught by the sling, and with my right hand I drew out the knife. I slashed upward. I ended up slashing up from the creature's right hip towards the left shoulder. It screamed and took a step back. This was my moment to run. I stepped backwards and fell down the side of the hill, rolling as I tried to not drop the knife and keep my rifle from being too damaged. At the bottom, I rolled to my feet and took off in a flat sprint. crashing through the brush like a train. I could hear heavy steps behind me. I knew if I looked back, I would most likely die. So I just kept running and trying to avoid hitting a random branch as they briefly came into view in the night vision, which had somehow stayed on my head. I'm not the strongest runner, but fear and adrenaline are excellent motivators. I came out of the forest and directly into the other 3 guys as they were on their way to me. They started yelling and asking what happened as I screamed, "Just fire away," as I tried to recover. They took my word for it and began shooting into the trees, emptying their mags on their 2 AR-15s and 1 AR-10. As their rifles became empty, they helped pick me up from the ground, and we started running down the trail and back towards the house. After what felt like forever running, we flew into the house and locked the door. We kept shifting our eyes to each other and out the nearest window. Once we felt like we had the air to talk, I explained what happened. They told me they heard the shots and started heading towards my direction, thinking I had found a mountain lion or somehow got injured, trying to signal for help. It was then that I realized I had likely dropped the radio when I fell down the hill, because they said they tried getting me on their radios, but I hadn't answered. It was only after I finished talking that my friend, whose family owns the ranch, said that they had heard strange things before, but never tried to investigate. None of us got any sleep that night, keeping watch out the 4 sides of the house with rifles loaded and ready. Lucky for us, nothing happened, and we got ready to leave once the sun crested the horizon. The drive home was uneventful and without much conversation. When I got home, I immediately undressed and just took a moment to stare in the bathroom mirror. I had a handful of scraped and scratches that I hadn't even noticed. My back was sore, and my right ankle felt a little sharp. That shower was one of the greatest feelings I had ever had. And when I was done, I collapsed on my bed and was instantly asleep for the next 15 hours. Coming face to face with that monstrosity was definitely the scariest moment of my life, and I haven't returned since then. It took over a year to finally get comfortable with being in the woods again, even though I still get a sinking feeling whenever I see the sun setting. What was it? I don't know, and quite frankly, I'm not interested in finding out. But if we meet again, I'll be sure to have plenty of bullets and a sharp knife with me. We had a tradition of going to see my grandfather every summer and spend some time at his cabin. The cabin by a lake, and older than he is. The cabin is a load of fun for a child spending their carefree summer. The one thing I disliked about the cabin was there was no indoor washroom. A shower was set up outside. An outhouse a few steps off into the woods was the worst thing about the cabin. I hated using that thing. Bugs always took over the inside, and I had a fear of something reaching up to grab me if I sat down. We begged my grandfather to get indoor plumbing. He only got a tub hooked up, but his water heater can only handle so much, so we were banned from using it in the summer. The place was just barely held together. It would be cheaper to buy a new cabin than to renovate it, but we still went every year, always forgetting the negatives, until we finally arrived. Even my father complained about the outhouse, and he never really complained about anything. My grandfather also had a rack of hunting rifles and 1 shotgun. He told all of us to never touch them, and to respect the weapons. He left the cabinet they were inside locked, his guns unloaded, and the ammo hidden somewhere in the cabin. He took no chances with the guns around a bunch of kids. He always said he would whoop some ass if he ever saw us touching them, and told us it was because he loved us and didn't want an accident to happen. I asked why he kept the guns. I didn't see him using them very often aside from shooting a deer or 2. I would see him go off into the woods while we swam with a rifle on his shoulder, but he normally never came back with some animal he shot. I don't think he would kill something to waste, leaving it behind, or did I think he was a bad shot? He may walk slowly, but his eyesight was better than ours. He always knew what might be going on. One time, my cousin found a cigarette someone dropped near the corner store, where we sometimes got ice cream snacks. He kept it hidden for a day. When he thought that the coast was clear, he used one of the lighters for the fire pit. He didn't even take a drag before our grandfather came out yelling at him, scaring us all to death. With 3 kids crying, begging him not to tell our parents, he gave us mercy. As long as we cleaned the boat we've been putting off all weekend. Overall, my grandfather was a scary man. One night, after telling each other ghost stories to freak each other out, the worst thing happened. When everyone else was dead asleep, I needed to use the restroom. I hated going out at night. It might be only a few steps, and yet it felt like a mile walk. Things croaked off in the woods, which were perfectly normal noises for a forest. When you're a kid, full of ghost stories and listening to these things, those noises turned into killers and ghosts waiting to scoop you up. I went through the cabin to the back door, knowing that I couldn't hold it until morning. There was a flashlight by the door. I turned it on only to have it flicker off. It was the kid's job to make sure the flashlight had new batteries. Sometimes we switched them to out the good ones in the shared Game Boy for a few more hours of playtime. It finally came back to bite us. However, since the full moon was out, I had taken the path 100 times before, so I went on without the flashlight. I feared what my grandfather would do if I woke him up, trying to find new batteries. Slipping on my shoes, I went off in the backyard and down the short path to use the washroom. I heard a noise, and I looked over my shoulder and walked faster, fearing what might be looking at me in the dark. That was a mistake. Going without a flashlight and not paying attention to where I was going could have killed me that night. The longer I walked, the more afraid I was. It should not take this long to get to the outhouse. Another crack of a twig made me jump. I could no longer hold it and needed to step off the path to do my business and carry on. I hated going to the washroom out in the woods. At least it was quick, and I was back on the path towards the cabin. But was I? Nothing looked right. The trail appeared too overgrown. I didn't understand how I had gone so far off the path. In my mind, I went the right way the entire time, and I only got lost when I stepped aside. Fear nearly froze me to the spot, forcing my body to move. I started going down where I thought I had came from, praying to find the path again. At this point, I called out for someone to come and get me. A sound came, and I shut my mouth. Heart beating so fast that it hurt. I looked around trying to see what was stalking a poor scared kid in the dark. Something flew at me. Wings flapping and a screeching cry made me snap. That's when I ran, screaming, trying to get away from whatever this thing was. Only when I stopped running and was very lost, I realized I just got scared by a bat. Just a normal, harmless bat. I wanted to cry. Unless someone noticed I wasn't in my sleeping bag when they woke up to go to the bathroom as well. No one would know I was missing until morning. How long would it take until someone did notice? I skipped breakfast pretty often. They might even assume I was just sleeping in. I didn't want to stay out in the woods overnight. Having no other options or ideas of what to do while lost, I kept walking while trying to force back my tears. I had forgot it was best to stay in one spot while being lost in the woods. Just going deeper in them wasn't the best idea. I felt cold, scared, and was getting bit by bugs. My heart almost broke over the idea of being out there forever, starving to death, and no one ever knowing what happened. Thinking back to the books I needed to read in school, I wonder if I could live out in the woods until they found me. If I find clean water and could figure out how to make a fire, I might be able to. The issue being, I never actually started a fire without a lighter. I tried with sticks, but it always took too long, and we always gave up. Me and my cousins loved burning things and were impatient. There was always a lighter to use. I wanted to try and find the cabin until the sun rose. If I still was in the woods by tomorrow night, I would buckle down to figure out how to make fire. Wait, wouldn't someone smell the smoke and find me sooner? Or would I burn the entire forest down? Getting motivated, I started to look for a clearing that I could use for a fire pit. It took a while, but I found a spot where the ground looked to be mostly dirt. It took longer to find a stone I could use to start digging out a hole in the dirt for my fire pit. My hands cold and the rock cut into my fingers a few times. Then, I needed to find the right sticks to get the fire started. And then finally, get enough wood to keep it going if I did get one started. I didn't go out of sight of the clearing, as I collected what I needed. Exhausted by the time I thought I was ready, my pit was filled with dry leaves and small sticks. I sat down ready to try to get a fire started. I used 2 sticks I peeled the bark off at first. My hands became raw from rubbing them together. Frustrated, I didn't think I could get them warm enough from the friction to get anything started. I then tried the rock method. I didn't know if any rocks would do, or if my grandfather had a special type in his fire starting kit. A miracle of the night happened when I found the right rocks to smash together. One spark caught and I nearly fainted when the leaves burned and yet didn't catch fire. I kept trying until I had a very small flame that I actually fed with my breath. I've never been so proud of myself in my entire life. The smoke blew into my face, causing me to cough and eyes water. Still very happy for my very small fire though. There wasn't a way to tell how long I was out there for. The sun hadn't even risen yet, so at least a few hours. As I warmed myself by the flames, I heard something off in the distance of the woods. I heard it again. My chest got tight with hope when I recognized that the noises I was hearing were human voices. No one I knew, but still someone out here in the woods with me. With my fire still going, I would be able to see my way back to the clearing if needed. I hurried off towards the voices, so happy I couldn't speak.
Mine.
The voices were a warning for the person they were speaking with. It sounded strange, as if English wasn't their first language. Still, it was someone who could help. At least, that's what I thought. Rushing into another clearing, all my excitement faded when I saw what belonged to those voices. A dead, torn to pieces deer sat in the middle of the small clearing, blood soaking the grass and leaves. In the clear moonlight, I saw 3 pale things, figures, all hunched over in the deer, tearing in with their hands and teeth. All their limbs were skinny and far too long for their bodies. Each of them were pushing aside each other, trying to eat as much of the deer as they could. Skin pale and drawn tight against their bones, faces covered with blood, each of them bald, with a mouth far too large for their face. And their eyes, oh God, their eyes were missing. Each of them had black empty sockets. None of them noticed me. That is, until I let out a scream. All 3 heads darted up. Now knowing there was some fresh prey, I turned to run. Sounds from behind me said they were all starting to chase me. Tears came to my eyes, making it nearly impossible to see where I was going. I slammed into a tree hard enough to hit my arm to the point I thought it was broken. I tumbled to the ground, crying in pain. My moment of weakness enough for one creature to get on top, limbs on either side. The head looking around trying to hear where I was. the large mouth opening, dripping blood on my tear-stained face. The moment before the mouth filled with teeth tore my face off, a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest. The creature blown off. I screamed even more when a powerful hand grabbed my shoulder to drag me to my feet. Grandpa. I choked up when I saw him clearly through my wet eyes. He was holding a shotgun, ready to fire again. His face stern, not afraid or surprised of the creatures. I expected them to attack us. They somehow knew what the gun could do. Grabbing their dead, they dragged it deeper into the darkness. The moment they were out of sight, I heard the worst noise. Awful sounds of bones cracking and breaking. They were eating the one my grandfather had shot. It was all too much for me. I broke down crying, my grandfather silently bending over to pick me up in one arm. As he carried me through the woods, he stomped out my small fire on the way out. He didn't scold me for crying or getting lost. Him actually comforting me that night was the kindest moment we ever shared together. We arrived back by the time the sun was rising. My mother and father awake and worried out of their mind. They scooped me up when we arrived, and I cried all over again. Before we left, I was able to get my grandfather alone to ask him what happened. Those things wouldn't bother us at the cabin. I only saw them because I went too far in the woods. Apparently, he had a deal with them, that they were not to touch any humans as long as he fed them, and he also wasn't sure how many of them lived in the woods, or even what they were. He also said that he fully understood if I didn't want to come back to the cabin next year. I almost didn't, until he passed away of natural causes. I spent parts of my summer at the cabin. He wasn't able to get an indoor toilet, but he did mark the path to the outhouse with those solar charged lamps that people use in their garden to make sure that no one ever goes off the path again.